Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about mostly typography, and I'm going to cover some of the basics of typography. So my lecture will not be that long. Right now, I'm answering questions with regard to the postcard assignment. And the question that Natalie has is, how do you check the resolution in Photoshop? So if I'm looking at this image of mine right here, it looks quite large with it when I have rulers up. And if you haven't memorized this yet, it's Command or Control R. Control if you're on the PC, Command R. Make sure that I have that selected. There we go, Command R. Command R turns on and off, it toggles on and off rulers. If you're on the PC, it should be Control. So you probably can't see my rulers that well, but it shows that the width of this image is over 35 inches wide. That's huge. I'm thinking this is poster size. Damn, I'm in good shape. You know, I can make a big poster out of this. But without knowing the resolution of the image, the actual physical size of it is meaningless. So if I wanted to find out how big this would be if I to print in a high quality, with a high quality printer, then what I would need to do, the best way of doing that is, you can look down here in the lower left-hand corner, and it shows that it is a little over 35 inches by 20 inches at 72 pixels per inch. So the next question is, well, how big would this image be if I were to make it 200, 240 pixels per inch? To do that, you need to go to image size. And you need to make sure that resampling is turned off. And it will be at this time, I can change it. So let me focus on the resolution. And what it does is that when I work at a higher resolution, it takes all of those pixels at 72 pixels per inch, and instead of 72 pixels per inch, now you have 200, 300 pixels per inch, and it makes a smaller image from it. But there's no degradation in quality of the image. It's just reorganizing the pixels so that you have higher density of pixels per inch. So now I can change this to 240. And you can see that it's a very small image. It's a little over 10.5 by 6 inches. It's not very big. It would work great for my postcard. It would work great. You know, I could probably, because this was created digitally rather than scanned, I could probably take it and reduce this to maybe 200 pixels per inch. Now it's almost, 13 inches by a little over 7 inches. So it's a nice size image. So that's how you control that. Now, if you're working with a small image, so let me reset this. Anytime you want to reset one of these panels, hold down the Option key on the Mac, the Alt key on the PC, and it changes from cancel to reset, and it goes back. So that's how you do that. That's true for all of the panels, the little pop-up menus that come up. So for a small image, or if you wanted to make a minor change, what I could do is I could turn resampling on. And let's say I wanted to make it an even 40 inches, Then what I could do is I could say here, when I have resample turned on, I could say preserve details in enlargement and make sure that I reduce the noise that would be created by doing that by 85%. That's a good kind of default image. So now I could go ahead and I could change this. It's still 72 pixels per inch, but I could change this to 40 inches, and it automatically, because it's linked, the width and the height are linked, but not the resolution, you can see that it would be 40 by 22 at 72 pixels per inch. And when you zoom in on it, it still looks pretty good. And that's because it was, created digitally. But typically, if you scan images, they don't hold up so well if you enlarge them too much. So, Natalie, does that answer your question, I hope? Yes, no? Yeah, okay, good. I hope it answers everybody else's question too. Now, the other thing is, remember when I told you to start a brand new file, like so, if I were to go new, because this is a surefire way to make sure that your final image is the correct size and resolution. That if I wanted this to be a horizontal image, 7 by 5, 240 pixels per inch, or maybe you only wanted it 200, and I created that, and I dragged all of my other images into this one, I would know, because it will, anytime you drag an image into an existing file like this, it will automatically resize it, and it will also convert the resolution to that of the current file. So if I were to do that, if I were to take an image from my desktop, let me see if I have something here that I can drag in here. Well, this is going to turn out to be big. So if I go ahead and I'm going to open up a photograph of, here's a JPEG of my dog Bagel. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open it in Photoshop. And this was taken with my camera, and this has already been edited and refined and stuff. And you can see that it's quite big. You know, it's 20 inches wide and it's 13 inches deep, but it could be 72 pixels per inch. I don't know. So I could go up to image size, but another way to figure out if this is going to be a large image or a small one is to use the move tool, click and drag up to my new document, drag down, hold down the shift key and release. And there you go. It's basically postcard size. It's very small. I was thinking maybe it was big. So that image must have been, if I go back to the Bagel image, and now let's look. If I go to image size, yeah, it's 20 by 14 pixels, but it's 72 pixels per inch. And remember, I created my new document at 240. So when I do that, I turn off resample, you can see that it's only 6 by 4 inches. But if I only wanted the image of my dog, to, incorporate that into my postcard, it would be, a good size. That would be a perfect size. It'd be nice big. If I needed it smaller, I could make it smaller. If I needed a little bit bigger, I could do that. But if I wanted it double or triple the size, no, it wouldn't work out that well. Okie doke. So, typography, that's what we're going to talk about now. Because the next lesson is creating which we'll cover on Thursday, lesson 7. We'll be covering the type tool, which is located over here on the left-hand side. But in the meantime, I don't know how many of you have had a class in typography. So that's what I want to do, is I want to talk about that. So I'm just going to move Photoshop aside. I'm going to bring up my browser. Come on. Here we go. And this is a handout that I have on my webpage that I created a while ago on the basics of typography, so that you understand the nomenclature that's used in describing typography. That you also understand how type is measured, things like that, understand the different parts of the letter forms. And then you'll have a better understanding of the tools available in Photoshop and how they function regarding typography. So I've started off here with a little headline that says typography, the basics. Okay, so this is my primer. Just to let you know, typeface that I've used here is Roman, which is kind of like the grandfather of all modern typography. These letter forms existed in their original form during Roman times and were lifted from Trajan's column in Rome, that were chiseled into the stone. And at that time, the letter forms that existed were only capital letters, and that was it. There were no lowercase letters. Those developed much later. Really elegant, beautifully designed, had a very complex proportioning system so that the O's took up more space than the I's. And, you know, every letter was proportioned correctly to its size. It incorporated these little feet thingies called serifs that at the time were developed because they were of how they were chiseled into the stone. But in later years, they're discovered that these serifs actually do have a function and that they help to, they serve in the readability of type, and they make it a little bit more legible and easy to read, especially when you have large blocks of type. And that's why it's used extensively in newspapers and magazines and that sort of thing. Over the years, a lot of different categories of type have developed. There are 5 basic categories. There's the one that I just showed you, serif. And it's these little feet thingies, that little extensions that come off some of the letters that are what are called serifs. Then in the early 20th century, as technology developed, sans serif typefaces were developed. And once they were developed, which sans serif, which means without serifs, what that opened up is a much greater, many more possibilities for different fonts that could be derived from a single typeface. You could have a normal typeface, you could make it bold, you could make it italic, you could have it extended, you could make it condensed, because the proportioning could be system of the letter forms could be manipulated much easier this way. Some serif typefaces have italic associated with them. Some of them have bolder typefaces, some not. Some are very limited. Some, like Roman, is just Roman and that's it. Then there's script, which is taken from original pen, hand, scripted letters, and was formalized later during the probably around 1000 AD or so, a little bit before, some after. I'm going to say around that, during medieval times. Black letter was developed, and it has some use today by some groups of people. But it was the principal letter forms that were used, creating with a broad pen, and by monks create manuscripts. And it was at this time that the lowercase letters, along with script, were developed, okay, for hand lettering. And then the last category is decorative. Everything else falls under the category of decorative. And in this day and age, with typography being designed, new letter forms being designed, new fonts being designed digitally, there are just thousands and thousands of possibilities. So most of them now would be considered in the decorative category. If you're not sure, if it's not clearly serif, sans serif, script, or black letter, then just put it in the decorative category. However, having said that, there are really fundamentally only 3 different categories, because in most cases, serif and sans serif can be used for everything. They can be used for headlines, subheads of your design documents. They can be used for the body copy equally well. And as I said, with the serif typefaces, you'll notice in most publications that they use serif, Times Roman. It's the default in many computers. because it reads well at a small size. Not so well on the web these days, but that's a different story altogether. Script, in this day and age, it's very difficult for people to read large blocks of text that has been written out in script. So it's used primarily for headlines, maybe subheads, and also for special functions like for, wedding announcements or birth announcements, things like that, that want to add, when you want to add kind of an air of formality, of elegance to whatever it is that you're designing. Black letter too is very difficult to read in large blocks of text. Although, many of the early Carolingian manuscripts said around, 800, 900, 1000 AD, were written in black letter. But in this day and age, if you were to set type, set a magazine in black letter, it would be near impossible to read the darn thing. It's too hard on the eyes. The same holds true for decorative. So, when you have large blocks of text, avoid using script, black letter, or decorative. Reserve script, black letter, and decorative for headlines and subheads, anything that where it's just a few words and it's fairly large. So that's that. Those are the basic categories. Then within the categories, and you can see that how type has been organized, is it's sort of been anthropomorphized, is that we have your basic categories. Then within those categories, there are different families of type. So for example, Helvetica would be a family of type. Within that family, and that's what I used here, there are any number of faces available, okay? So we have, well, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The family would be under the category sans serif. The particular face that we would be using is Helvetica. The individual font would be either, if it's condensed bold, condensed black, light, bold italic. I haven't even used all of the possibilities that are available here for italic or for Helvetica, but there are many, many. So think of it this way. If you have a family, right? And the family is, in my case, it would be Miller. Within that family, there are different members of the family. We have grandparents, we have parents, we have children, we have aunts and uncles, and so on and so forth. They all look very similar to one another, and they have certain distinguishing characteristics that they share in common, but they all look unique. They are all individual, and they have been designed, with these individual looks in mind. And those individual fonts, what you see here within the family of the typeface, Helvetica, okay, or what you see down here. So a font comprises all of the capital letters, all of the lowercase letters, and all the numerals and special characters. So that's what a font is. So if you've ever wondered on your computer, when you're using Word or anything like that, when they talk about the font, that's what they're talking about here. And the font falls under the category of a specific typeface, and that typeface falls into a specific category or a family, family of type. And that category could be serif or sans serif, or, said it could be decorative type and that sort of thing. Now, each of the letter forms, I'm sorry, I'm getting texts here while I'm talking. Each of the letter forms and have parts associated with them that have a name. And this is the nomenclature that I was talking about that have been assigned to them. So when you're working with type in Photoshop or Illustrator, or in any program for that matter, digitally, all of those letter forms rest on a line. And that line is called the baseline. And in Photoshop, you can, by default, it rests on the baseline, but there are tools that you have available to you to move the type above or below the baseline, if you wish, for any particular reason. Then in addition to that, we look at how type is measured. Then it's measured from the baseline sometimes to this midline here. This midline is where the lowercase letters all rise to. And this can vary depending on how the font is designed. Now, the distance from the baseline to that waistline is called X height. The measurement from the baseline to the top of the capital letter is called the cap height. But that's not how type itself is measured. You'll notice that in this particular design, and I've used Times Roman for this, is that there are parts of the letter forms that extend above, the lowercase letters that extend above the waistline and below the baseline. Well, some of them, in this particular instance, notice that the extension of the D here extends above a cap height, okay? Now, it doesn't in all cases, depending on the design. And the part of the, some letter forms extend below the baseline, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. Well, the part of the letter form that extends above the waistline is called the ascender, and part of the letter form that extends below the baseline is called the descender. Those are important terms that you should commit to memory. Ascender, descender, not so much waistline or X height. That isn't used that much anymore. Cap height is, but more importantly, when you want to understand how type is measured, it goes from the bottom of the descender, a descender, to the top of the ascender. So it may be the case that when you have a line of type that you don't have any ascenders or descenders, so it could appear to be quite small. Likewise, you may think, oh, I'm using 72-point type, but it still looks a little small to me. And that's because of how it's designed, that maybe some of the type that you've used has an ascender that extends far above a cap height, and you have a descender that extends far below the baseline. So these are the various parts of the letter. There are many more parts that we could talk about. You talk about the bull, you can talk about legs and arms, and again, they anthropomorphize everything, or a lot of typography that are associated with it, like the Ks. Ks have arms and legs and you name it. So anyway, that's that. The next thing that I want to talk about with regard to type is how it's measured. So this is the nomenclature that's used measuring, and it existed before computers, and it continues to this day to exist. Type is measured in points and picas. It's important to know that there are 12 points to a pica, and there are 6 picas to an inch. So if you do the math and you want to know how many points there are in an inch, there are 72. You simply multiply 6 times 12 and you get 72. Okay. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, that the type size is measured from the top of the ascender to the bottom of the descender, or vice versa, from the bottom of the descender to the top of the ascender, whichever you want to say. So you'll notice that form of measurement is still used to this day when you're measuring type. So when you use, a cap height of 72 points, okay, that's about an inch. Also, ruled lines are measured in points as well. If you were to get the measurement in inches, and it would be in decimal points, it really would be hard to imagine. For me, I know what a 1-point rule looks like. I know what 36-point type looks like, about the size, no matter what the font I'm using or what typeface I've chosen. I have a pretty good idea of the size of it. But if it's given to me in fractions of an inch, it doesn't make any sense to me. So this is how type is measured. And you'll see when we use it in Photoshop, it's still to this day the unit of measurement that's used. Next thing, terminology, continuation of nomenclature. Capital letters are also called uppercase or UC. The small letters are also called lowercase or LC. And that terminology was derived from back in the day when type was set by hand, and they used lead type that was set in forms that back in the day, when you think of what a print shop looked like in Benjamin Franklin's day in the 18th century. And the reason that they got their name, which I find sort of interesting, is that the capital letters were in cases that were above, so they were in the uppercase, and the small letters were in the cases below, so they were the lowercase. And that's, again, that terminology is stuck today. It's been around for several hundred years now. There are also tools that you have in Photoshop and Illustrator and other programs to selectively adjust the space between letters and letter forms and words. It's done automatically, but when you have large text that you're using for a headline or for maybe the title of a book or something, that when it's automatically measured, when it gets fairly large, sometimes the space between letters or words looks a little bit there's a little bit too much space, and you can selectively adjust that. And what that term is called is kerning. And there is a tool inside Photoshop that allows you to adjust or to kern type. If you want to uniformly adjust the space between letters and words in a line of type, that is called tracking. And again, there is a tool inside Photoshop and Illustrator that allow you to do that. The space between different lines of type is called leading. And again, that's kind of like the uppercase and lowercase. That goes back to the 18th century. Because how that was developed is that if they wanted to put more space between lines of type, they would take little slivers of lead and insert it in that block of type that they were putting together. And still to that day, even though we don't use leading anymore, it is a term that is still used. Okay. Last couple of things. Now, the basic, this is not, think of this like an ad, although it's not an ad. This is a layout for, it would be a tabloid size newspaper. But even if it were an ad, it would still, they fall under similar size categories. And that if you look at the top here, this would actually be the masthead of the document. But if it were an ad, then it's called your headline. And then these would be subheads in an ad. In a magazine or newspaper, rather, these wouldn't be the subheads, these would be the headlines. Okay, because this is instead, would be your masthead. So if this is the masthead, gives the name like the New York Times or something like that, LA Times, that's what you would see here. So each of these would be these large, typographic elements would be your headlines. But in an ad, this would be your headline, these would be your subheads, and then this is your body copy, just copy. Okay. So it goes in successive order. You know, headlines, typically they don't have to be the largest element on your page, but typically they are. The same with subheads, and typically the copy is the smallest element. The next question that you may want to know is then, well, what are the size ranges for each of these? So for an 8.5 inch, a letter size document, 8.5 by 11 inches, or even tabloid size, which is 11 by 17. These are the basic starting sizes that you would have. Copy basically goes from 8 to 13 point. And so in most newspapers, they use, you know, in that range, depends on the newspaper. Could be, you know, very small type, could be 8 point, could be 11 or 12. 13 is pretty rare. That gets to be fairly large. And then column widths, depending on how many columns you have on a page. On a newspaper, you can have as many as 6, 8 columns. So if there are a number, you know, quite a few columns on a page, they would be 13.5 picas wide. In a book, the largest column width you typically would have, or in a magazine, would be 48 picas. So the reason for those minimum and maximum sizes is that it has to do with legibility, is that when you're reading a document, if it's any less, let's say if it's any more than 48 picas, it's very difficult for the eye to track from one line to the next. So they found that 48 picas is really kind of the maximum. And the same for small columns that you would see, you know, narrow columns that you would see in a newspaper. You would probably want it no less than 13.5 picas wide. Any less, then you're having to track too many times from one line to the next. So that's generally a good starting point. As far as the type size for the copy, it varies and it depends on the look that you're going for. Subheads generally can range, again, for an 8.5 by 11 document, or even sometimes a tabloid size can start at 14 point and go up around to 18 point. And headlines can start at 24 point and they can go as big as you want. Now, the different sizes of these, I said, can be, depending on how you organize and design your page. Don't have to follow that format, but that's sort of a typical, you know, order that you have, because headlines typically are the largest, the most important element on the page. Actually, on a newspaper, it's the masthead, that's the biggest. And then your subheads, a little bit smaller, copy, smaller yet. And if you have, for example, descriptions for images on your document, then they're even smaller than that. Then they could be 6 point, or they would be the smallest element on the page. Okay, so that's typography in a nutshell. I told you that this wouldn't take that long. So I have nothing more to add. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pause the recording and see if there are any questions from any of you. And if there aren't, then we will call it a day. Okay, and on Thursday, I will go over all of the basic tools that we have in typography, using the type tool in Photoshop. So I'm going to go ahead and pause. So if you want a PDF file of this for reference when you're working with type, because the next assignment after the, when you're creating your postcard, you're supposed to add type, but type will be more important when we do the movie poster assignment, which will be your next one. But where that can be found is if you go to either handouts or weekly syllabi. Let's just go to weekly syllabi. And you scroll down and over to the left, you can see here where I have the typography primer. That's where I got this. So you can, this is a PDF file. You can open it in Acrobat and you can save it. And it sure is. If you want to print it, you can print it, whatever. Okay. So that's that. Okay. That's where I got that. I'm going to pause the recording again for a minute. So if there aren't any more questions, we are done for today and you are free to go, and have a good afternoon. And I will see all of you Wednesday, and I will cover the type tool in Photoshop. Now you'll have a little bit of a background to understand how the type tool works and what terminology is used and nomenclature, how type is measured and all that good stuff. Okie doke. So if that's it, I'm going to say goodbye and I'll stop recording.